Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the New Zealand Initiative. My name is Oliver Hartwig. I'm the Executive Director of the initiative. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to tonight's event. We're launching a new report tonight, Up or Out, with a big question mark, examining the trade-offs of urban form. And if you like, this is the fourth report in a trilogy. So last year, we produced 3 reports on housing affordability, and in the course of the research, we encountered this ideology of compact cities or urban densification or smart growth. There are many names for the same phenomenon, the idea that you should really just make people live in existing urban areas rather than releasing more land in greenfield areas. And after we published the last report in the trilogy, we decided to continue our housing research, our planning research, and analyze this question more specifically. And the result is the report we're launching tonight. So I asked my colleague Jason Krupp and Khyaati Acharya to investigate this issue. And Jason has a background in journalism. He is a journalist originally from South Africa, has a degree from Rhodes University in South Africa in journalism, then worked in Hong Kong, and then worked for many years as a business journalist in New Zealand. And when I asked Jason to look into the whole question of whether this idea of urban densification really made much sense, he took it as a journalist and took it as one big investigative project. What is this all about? What are the ideas driving it? Does it really make sense? And where are the bodies buried? And what can we find out about this whole ideology? And he teamed up with Khyaati Acharya, who many of you will know as the co-author of 2 of our reports on foreign direct investment, and the 2 investigated for about half a year. And tonight they're going to present their findings. And if I could briefly summarize your talk before you even give it, the findings probably are not so much up or out, but up and out, because we really come to the conclusion in this report that there shouldn't be an ideology about planning, that we should really have a reasoned debate, and that sometimes it is not an up or out, it can be both. And sometimes it's not public versus private transport, it can be both. But what we should have is a proper debate in New Zealand, how we want to build our cities, how we can make sure that the cities of the future will be livable, they will be mobile, and they will be affordable. And we won't get there to these positive solutions that we would all like to see if we just blindly follow an ideology, but we need to get the facts. And to present the facts to you tonight, we've got the authors with us, so please welcome Jason Krupp.
Thank you very much. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome. This evening, Khyaati and I are very proud to launch our report, which was 6 months in the making, which we titled Up or Out, Examining the Trade-offs of Urban Form. This report came about, as Oliver mentioned, as part of our housing affordability series. What that 3-part series indicated was that amongst councils and amongst planners, there was the rise of this ideology, the compact city ideology, and that this was being reflected in policy, and this policy was in turn restricting the supply of land. But it did just really brush over this, and this is why we were asked to look more deeply into it. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with compact cities, and I doubt there are very many of you, there is a school of thought that is principally concerned with sustainability and sustainability in cities and sustainable use of resources, be it electricity, building materials, fuel, or indeed land. And in some sense, this ideology was a reaction to the explosive growth of cities seen in the developed world since World War II, which were also sped up by buoyant economies, growing populations, the adoption of the motor vehicle, and mass urbanization. And with this growth has come numerous problems. We have high property prices, which we're all familiar with in New Zealand, but rush hour gridlock, smog, social isolation, and crowding, just to name a few. In fact, New Zealand is wrestling with many of the same problems that cities all over the world are wrestling with. Auckland, Christchurch, and Wellington are considered chronically congested. The vast majority of New Zealand cities are indeed experiencing severe housing problems. Now, the proponents of compact cities, and this is will be a bit crude in the in the interest of time, you see, but the proponents of compact cities argue that changes to urban form are the solution to all of the problems I've just spoken about. That by restricting the outward spread of cities, urban centres will be forced to make more efficient use of land and build up instead of out. Development will occur closer to places of work or be positioned on transit corridors, making walking, cycling, or commuting via train or bus more feasible. The upside will be a decrease in the overall land use, fuel consumption, a drop in air pollution, the preservation of the countryside, and more affordable housing, because we'll be using land more efficiently. So given this clean, green, and economically vibrant vision of the future, it's very hard for voters to oppose the adoption of a compact city, and especially when we examine the problems of the status quo. Indeed, this is exactly what's happening in New Zealand. Many of New Zealand's cities are in the process of enacting compact city policies, or at least considering them. Auckland is the most obvious example that springs to mind with its unitary plan, but Wellington and Christchurch similarly have policies that could be regarded as compact city policies, and centres like Tauranga have actually had them in place since 2006. So the question we wanted to assess is, does the ideology of compact planning actually deliver on its promises? And this can be a difficult one for the average person to actually unpack. Urban form changes are highly technical, require the input of professionals such as economists, planners, engineers, geologists, and lawyers, to name just a few. And it means that any material debate on urban form changes is limited to the professional elite. It also means that the process is inscrutable to the general public. The Auckland Unitary Plan, for example, is a rulebook which details the radical changes the city will undergo over the next 3 decades. But at 7,000 plus pages, it's not an easy topic. It's not an easy document for the general public to digest. It also happens to be about 3 times longer than another piece of controversial legislation which you might know, called Obamacare. This means that in the consultative process, when it comes to urban form changes, this consultative process, because it's complex, is often pitched in simplified emotive terms, and there's little discussion about the real-world trade-offs around urban form changes. So, for example, Tauranga's Smart Growth strategy carries the banner of live, learn, work, play, and its regional business strategy is called Smart Economy. That kind of paints a landscape where anybody who's opposed to it seems to be in favor of a dumb economy. So, given this, these are the 4 areas we decided to focus on. We undertook to determine whether compact cities delivered on housing affordability, transport, livability of cities, and overall economic efficiency. The research we present in this report suggests that compact cities often fail to deliver meaningful improvements in these areas, and in some cases make the original problem worse. A good case of this is looking at land and property prices. It's probably the most pressing issue for many people, and it's certainly an election issue. And on the surface of it, compact cities seem to support housing affordability. Proponents of compact cities argue that this urban form can improve housing affordability because it forces developers to build up instead of out with the use of urban growth boundaries. These urban growth boundaries, Auckland's one is called the Metropolitan Urban Limit. These boundaries also mean that you force developers to, the incentive is for developers to build more than one housing unit on a parcel of land. And since supply is not constrained by land, you should be able to produce more housing units, and this extra supply should lower prices. In reality, it does the very opposite. We can see this using Demographia's median multiple. For those of you who are unfamiliar with what a median multiple is, it's a calculation of how many median salaries, annual salaries, are required to pay off the median house price. And it's a bit of a broad brush measure, but it does account for variations in regional economies, and income and housing prices. And it may be a crooked ruler, but provided you use the same crooked ruler, you can still use it as a useful tool. It's important to note that the benchmark for affordability is about a multiple of about 3 times. That's to say that 3 instances of the median annual salary are required to pay off the median annual house price. And this is the upper threshold of affordability. On this measure, the track record for compact cities and those that have constrained urban growth is pretty alarming. Hong Kong, for example, has a median multiple of 14.9. This is followed by Vancouver, San Francisco, Sydney, San Jose, and Melbourne. Auckland, a city that's been pursuing urban growth strategies in one form or another for several decades, has a median multiple of 8, ranking it as the 7th most unaffordable city in the international survey. That stands starkly at odds with the track record of dispersed cities seen in the United States and Europe, ones that are pro-development and pro-growth, which have managed to foster affordable housing markets for decades. The practical reality of this can be seen here. This presentation, these slides were actually shared with us by Phil Hayward, who helped us in our research, and we'd like to thank him for his contribution to this project. So Houston has a median multiple of 3, and this is what 200,000 New Zealand dollars will buy you. To purchase the equivalent in Manchester, you would have to pay 600,000. The equivalent in Vancouver, about $1 million, and on the North Shore, about 750,000. It's also worth noting that Vancouver is very often used as a case study of a successful compact city. Looking at it another way, we know what $200,000 buys you in Houston, but this is what it buys you in Manchester. This is what it buys you in Vancouver. That's one apartment. You can't actually buy housing in Vancouver for $200,000. And this is what it buys you in LA. This is what it buys you in Auckland, Hamilton, Tauranga, and Wellington. And while this might be acceptable housing stock, the real question we should be asking is, why does it cost? Why, for $200,000, do we get this and not the Houston example? The evidence that's presented by the Demographia report begs 2 important questions. Why don't compact cities deliver affordable housing? And given this, why do city planners still pursue these development strategies? What we found is that in order to make the vision of a compact city a reality, you need a toolkit of rules. The rules determine where people can build, where they can't build, what they can build, what materials they will use to build, and so on. In short, you need a mountain of red tape. What we found was that and yet the research conducted by prominent urban economists Edward Glaser and Joseph Giorco shows that the cities in the US most afflicted by housing affordability issues were the ones with the most rigorous building restrictions. Furthermore, there is the presumption that building up is always cheaper than building out. Yet, in the grand scheme of things, a single unit dwelling is fairly cost effective compared to an apartment block, which requires extensive structural work. So you'll need significant amounts of concrete and rebar, say, compared to a residential house. Places like Auckland, when you look at measures of red tape, is in a double bind. The city has the metropolitan urban limit, which restricts the city from growing outwards. Plus, it's also got binding height restrictions, which stop the city from growing up. Is it any surprise that we've seen such astronomical house prices in that city? I guess if we were to rename our report for Auckland, it would be called Not Up, Not Out. And yet, from a planner's perspective, compact cities are appealing, and I suppose rational to some degree, because it allows you to limit the size of your utility networks, typically in the form of roads, gas, electricity, and telecommunications, but libraries and social infrastructure are also added into this. It also lets you spread the costs of this infrastructure again across a greater number of people on a per capita basis. So, for example, if you had 100 meters of road that was earmarked for residential development, under a dispersed model, you would have 5 houses on each side of the road, and so 10 householders in all who would share the costs of that infrastructure in their rates. However, under a compact model, where the standalone houses are replaced by 2 apartment blocks consisting of 40 properties in each, 80 in total, then the cost of this road would be significantly smaller for each resident. Similarly, the city would also benefit from 70 additional taxpayers under the compact model, as opposed to the dispersed model. Yet by adopting this model, city planners are ignoring the wider costs that they impose on city residents in the form of higher land prices. These are not just borne by property owners and ratepayers, but everybody in the city. Work conducted by Oliver Hartwich in his previous life at Policy Exchange and his colleague Alan Evans showed that identical IKEA products were more expensive in the UK than any other European country, principally because of high land costs. And from memory, it was about a 20% differential between the UK and the lowest country on the list. I'm sure this is actually backed up, and I'm also cherry-picking the research in our report. Our research in the report is far more extensive than I can actually convey in the short time I have in front of you. But economic research in the US has showed us that where you have excessive demand for housing amid limited supply because of red tape, increases in the price of housing quickly outpace wage growth. And this disproportionately affects the poor and the middle class, who are forced out of city centres by the rich. You only have to look north to see that actually happening. So to sum up on this chapter of land, I think it's fair to say that you could reasonably table numerous reasons for adopting compact city development. But please don't say it's to deliver affordable housing. I'm now going to hand over to Khyaati to speak to address some of our other chapters. Khyaati.
Good evening. Transport is a vital component in any city. Getting people from home to work, to school and other activities, as well as getting goods from suppliers and to buyers, is what makes a city work. But as we know, traffic congestion is a major problem within cities, and the worse congestion is, the less economically efficient they are, and the less appealing a place they are to live. This is certainly not a problem unique to New Zealand, with most cities around the world facing their own congestion woes. Proponents of the compact city philosophy argue that the answer to tackling congestion, tackling the congestion problem, is to invest more in public transport infrastructure, like trams, trains, and subways. Compact cities envision urban plans with a compact footprint, high population densities, and intensive public transport infrastructure, which boasts both high efficiency and high patronage, with the view that this will incentivise residents to substitute private vehicle use in favour of public transport. However, do compact cities actually deliver superior public transport infrastructure and lower congestion? Before we discuss the research, we must note that public transport refers predominantly to rail, trams, and subways, not buses, since buses use roads and therefore can be seen as a source of congestion. Compact city ideology does not have a long history within New Zealand, but for the purposes of this report, we decided to look at international research, analysing the effects of population density on traffic congestion. We chose US cities as opposed to European cities because their history and urban development more closely resembles that of New Zealand cities. The annual INRIX traffic scorecard compares the stated speed of urban roads in the US, Europe, and Canada against the actual speeds during peak travel times. Here are the 10 most congested cities in the US. However, here they are cross-referenced against their population densities. Just for comparison's sake, Auckland has a population density of just under 3,000 people per square mile. What is not obvious from the table is that 9 of these 10 of these cities have been following a compact development model for many years, and in many cases, decades. In fact, so are the 11th, 12th, and 13th most congested cities in the US, which are Miami, Chicago, and Portland. Only Houston, which was the 14th most congested city in the US at the time this data was compiled, is following a more pro-market development plan, rather than a strictly prescribed compact plan. What this shows is that instead of reducing or eliminating traffic, the INRIX data suggests that in fact, compact cities appear to be associated with congestion. It may seem counterintuitive that compact cities with large transit networks experience significantly higher congestion levels than dispersed cities. However, this stands for a number of reasons. Firstly, cities can only handle so much traffic throughput at any one time, so increasing the population density will naturally decrease this rate, since there will be more road users competing for a limited space, even with increased public transit usage. Secondly, cities have only so many resources to invest in transit networks like trains, trams, and subways. Transit investments entail a diversion of funds away from traditional transportation areas like road building and maintenance. This can be seen in Portland, Oregon, when during the 1970s, planners diverted funds away from road building and maintenance to invest heavily in a light rail system, even removing some roads, believing that this would reduce congestion by drawing some people out of their cars. Congestion was used as a tool by planners who thought that if congestion was bad enough, it would further incentivize people to use the light rail network. However, this appears to have failed, with only 7% of Portland's commuters reliant on the public transport network. What's more is that 3 out of every 4 light rail users were previously bus users, having simply substituted one system in favour of another as a result of the road removal. Furthermore, 10 years after light rail was introduced, the number of private vehicles in Portland has grown astronomically, with Portland's highways serving 55,000 vehicles per weekday, carrying more than 88,000 passengers than in the previous 10 years. This suggests that even if you build a light rail network, it is unlikely to make much of a dent in congestion levels, because most people will still exhibit a preference for private vehicles. This is supported by the findings of quantitative research conducted by the Reason Foundation, which analysed 74 of the largest metros in the US over a 26-year period. It found no link between investment in public transport infrastructure and congestion levels. The study indicates that additional investments in public transport infrastructure are unlikely to lure significant numbers of commuters out of their cars to actually make any real difference in congestion numbers. And public transport is simply not a perfect substitute for private vehicles. Firstly, public transport does not cater well for an individual's social behaviour. Many people, particularly women, are reluctant to choose public transport over private vehicles late at night because of safety concerns. Secondly, most public transport is laid out in a hub and spoke pattern network, with the most frequent services being from the outer suburbs into the city centre. But this assumes that everyone has the same travelling pattern and works in the CBD, when in actual fact in Auckland, only 13% of commuters work in the inner CBD. The problem is only compounded for those who not only have to travel to work, but also run errands on the way, like dropping children off to kindergarten, daycare or school, and also going to the grocery shop. Thirdly, there is the limitation of rail catchment zones, that is, the maximum area around a railway station within which people will choose to walk or drive to the station and catch a train, rather than drive to and from home to work. That means that those who live beyond the rail catchment zone area are more likely to choose private cars as their travel means, since the distance to the station is too far to justify driving, parking, riding, walking to their destination, when a private vehicle would likely be much faster and much more efficient. This catchment area of a train station along the rail line is extremely limited in Auckland, a total catchment area of 520 square kilometres out of the total 4,894 square kilometre area of Greater Auckland means that only 10.8% of Greater Auckland falls within a rail catchment zone. Over the last 30 years, there has not been one example where compact city development, with an overemphasis on public transport networks, has effectively tackled congestion in the US. This is not to say that public transport networks are at all unimportant, but rather that they are an important component of mixed transport options that are needed to ensure efficient travel within a city. The ideological perception that public transport networks are the only way a city can function is clear and address congestion is clearly misguided. Finding an optimal mix of private transport and public transport networks is the only way traffic can be tackled effectively and efficiently. And if investing in public transport networks does not make a significant dent in metropolitan congestion levels, it is even less likely that investing heavily in cycle lanes will have any effect. While this is obvious, compact city proponents argue that you can't discount the health benefits of compact cities so easily. They argue that by building up rather than out, residents will be more likely to walk or cycle to and from their destinations rather than driving, and will as a result be healthier and fitter than their suburban counterparts. At the very least, getting on and off a train is more active than sitting in your car. This increased physical activity is believed to lead to a lower level of obesity and obesity-related diseases, such as type 2 diabetes, heart disease, hypertension, cancers, and sleep apnea. Research has found that a 10% increase in the population density of a city actually reduces household travel on average by 3.5%. All things equal, this implies that a 100% increase in the population density of a city would actually reduce traffic volumes by just over a third, should the gains follow a straight line. However, research in the San Francisco Bay Area found that weather and topography meant that residents still often chose private motor vehicles over walking or cycling, even though the city had been designed to encourage non-car transport choices. And we only need to look to Asia to see that compact cities do not cure obesity. Hong Kong is characterized by extreme density, high use of pedestrian networks, and extensive public transport infrastructure, and is often used as a prime example of a compact city. But almost 37% of the population is overweight, and almost 2/3 of the population do not undertake the minimum physical activity recommended by the World Health Organization. And Singapore is facing a similar dilemma. Our examination of the evidence has shown then that the link between urban design and physical activity is at best very weak. But compact cities must surely reduce exposure to airborne pollutants by reducing traffic congestion and requiring people to walk, cycle, or use public transport rather than private vehicles. However, as we discussed earlier, evidence shows that this is also a fallacy, given that compact cities are often associated with more congestion and therefore more smog, not less. Research by the Environmental Protection Agency in the US shows a strong relationship between high population densities, traffic, and pollution concentrations. Residents in both urban and suburban areas are exposed to high levels of nitric oxide and ozone, but the concentrations are significantly higher in dense urban centres. Therefore, arguments for reshaping the urban form along a compact model on the justification of less exposure to pollution simply do not stack up, especially when set against the costs of changing the urban form. Another commonly held perception of compact city advocates is that the green spaces and vegetation within these cities will provide health benefits, both physical and mental. Certainly, research has shown that exposure to greenery and open space has many positive benefits to human well-being, including reduced stress, improved attention capacity, faster recoveries from illnesses, ameliorating physical activity among the elderly, as well as generally improved mood and well-being. But a dense urban form that necessarily requires more infrastructure can simply not host the same variety or volume of flora and fauna as low-density suburban fringes, and what greenery they do have is likely to decrease as a compact city grows. In Australia, a recent report into the effects of greenery found that many cities in the country were losing their foliage due to urban infill as population densities increased. In addition, research has identified a link between high population densities and high hospitalisation rates of people with serious mental illnesses. That is to say, dense environments are more likely to trigger a serious mental episode and be significantly more stressful than living in suburbia. It is certainly beyond the scope of this report to conclude that compact cities do not deliver benefits. Clearly, any level of increased activity is preferable to none. However, from the evidence we've examined, we can state that attempting to justify radical changes to urban form because of the perceived health benefits are overcooked, especially when set against the costs. I'll now give it back to Jason to discuss agglomeration and then conclude.
So agglomeration is possibly put forward as one of the main arguments by compact city proponents to increase density. In economics, agglomeration is an attempt to measure the benefits that come from urban proximity. It is well established that cities tend to be more economically efficient than non-urban areas when measured by wages and productivity on a per capita basis. These positive spillover effects, or agglomeration benefits, come from firms being situated closer to markets, suppliers, and sources of labour. This phenomenon is often used, as I said, by proponents of compact cities to justify increases in urban density. Indeed, the New Zealand Transport Agency is already using agglomeration benefits in its cost-benefit analysis on major Auckland transport projects, like the City Rail Link. Our research doesn't dispute agglomeration, but what it does suggest is that we need to treat this with caution. First, work by Motu has established that there is evidence of agglomeration elasticities in New Zealand, and that denser areas tend to be more productive than non-dense areas. But even they remained cautious about correlating population density and productivity. The emerging literature on the topic only agrees that agglomeration benefits occur, not why they occur. So productivity benefits could come from something like self-sorting instead of density in urban centres. Let me illustrate. Consider a technology company moving to Silicon Valley. They move to Silicon Valley because they gain a benefit from being close to tech talent, other tech firms, major customers, and the positive knowledge spillover effects that come from this. But does that necessarily imply that greengrocer would get the same benefits by moving to Silicon Valley? Even should the productivity and population relationship exist, Motu's work suggests that dramatic increases in density would only yield marginal increases in productivity. Auckland's population would have to double to lift productivity by 6.9%. Secondly, agglomeration benefits come with costs. Agglomeration comes with benefits and costs, and these costs come in the form of high land prices, a high cost of living, and traffic congestion, as we've discussed. Cities only offer a net benefit when the positive externalities outweigh the negative externalities. You can be situated down the road from a major customer, but this proximity is not a benefit if the congestion significantly slows down your ability to deliver goods and services to them. Similarly with cost of living. If the price you pay to live in a city exceeds the benefits you get from high wages and knowledge spillovers, it disadvantages you to live there because the benefits are outweighed by the costs. This was seen in research in the Netherlands in the early 2000s. Their economists noted that the outlying regions, which were less dense than the urban centres, saw greater productivity growth, and this was mainly attributed to congestion in urban centres. And yet, Amsterdam, one of these centres, is often cited as a vision of an ideal compact city. This is particularly important to bear in mind when we engage in the compact cities debate, because as we've shown, sustainable urban development practices exacerbate congestion, land prices, and the cost of living. In other words, they increase the negative spillover effects from agglomeration relative to the benefits. Summing up our report now, New Zealand cities, like many in the developed world, are beset by a number of challenges. The status quo of congested highways, high house prices, and bureaucratic gridlock are as unpalatable here as they are elsewhere in the world. That each of these problems needs to be addressed if New Zealand is to maintain and enhance its economic prosperity is without question. What is questionable, however, is whether reshaping our urban areas along the compact city mould will address these problems. We have shown, through academic research and the historic record, that compact cities are not a panacea for social, financial, and the infrastructure problems gripping modern cities today. There is no one-size-fits-all solution, nor is there a silver bullet. And the sooner we abandon ideology, the sooner we can start developing nuanced solutions to issues like congestion and house prices. The aim of this report was not to generate specific policy recommendations, but to unpack the highly technical argument surrounding urban form changes, so that the average citizen can participate in the discussion. Even so, it's evident from a high level that overly centralized planning and decision-making structures are one of the major contributing factors driving urban costs in New Zealand today. We would encourage a far more market-centric approach to development and the evolution of urban areas, which have been proven to work in various parts of the world. This would represent a radical change in policy direction for New Zealand and involve regulatory overhaul of a number of pieces of legislation. This in itself is clearly a long-term project, but that doesn't mean that city officials are unable to act until these reforms are completed. Council officials could explore more innovative forms of funding to ring-fence infrastructure costs from opening new land from general ratepayers. We're also encouraged to see that Local Government New Zealand are investigating measures for local councils to participate in the economic growth happening in their region. And there are certainly economies of scale to be achieved on infrastructure provision by amalgamating some of the utility services that New Zealand's 78 regional and territorial councils provide. In short, if we want to ensure that New Zealand cities thrive on measures of economic performance and livability, we need to cut the red tape, not add to it. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you, Khyaati. I'd just like to conclude on a few thoughts. Hearing the debate about environmental sustainability, I felt reminded of my own research I did in a previous life when I worked for Policy Exchange in London on similar issues, on housing affordability, on compact cities, and the answers you find when you actually go through the research are quite surprising at times. And I remember just two anecdotes from our own research. Often you hear the argument that you save on fuel costs and fuel expenditure and fuel consumption when you move towards a compact city model, until we found research at the time from the Netherlands that suggested, yes, residents in compact cities actually use less fuel because they have less to travel, of course, to work. But then we found that what you save during the weekdays, they make up for on the weekends because they just have to get out. We found that quite interesting. The other thing, and that relates to one of the questions about environmental sustainability and saving farmland, we also came across, and that was the idea that you have to really go for a compact development model in order to save some really valuable farmland out in the countryside. Now, what we found there was quite interesting. Of course, when you look at it from a biodiversity angle, often the land we save is not very biodiverse. It is agricultural, it is monocultural, and that is probably the least efficient form for biodiversity. But when biologists in Germany, for example, actually catalog biodiversity in the cities, I remember an example from the city of Frankfurt. The most biodiverse place in the city of Frankfurt was a used car market. And I remember research from Britain coming out of the University of Sheffield, and they cataloged biodiversities in English gardens and came to the conclusion that they rival rainforests. Because if you have a proper suburban garden, it is home to an incredible amount of species. So I think there are no clear-cut answers. I think the deeper you dig into all the different questions around compact cities, the more interesting it becomes. But I think one thing has become quite clear out of the report that was presented to you tonight is that it is a very interesting field of research. There are no easy answers, there are no shortcuts to it, and we need to have a proper debate. And this report is a contribution to the debate, and I congratulate Jason and Khyaati on their work. I'd like to invite you now to continue the conversation over compact cities, but I would also like to encourage you to, of course, purchase a copy of the report. Typically, it sells for $25. Tonight, we have made a compact price for you. You can get it for $20. Just ask one of my colleagues, and we're happy to sell a copy to you. For now, we are adjourned. Please join us for a glass of wine. Thank you.